The Millennia stories of Brian Aldiss. Continuing where I left off last video, with a Hegelian reading of Journey to the Interior, Brian Aldiss' short story, which was later called Gene Hive, and later The Mutant Millennia. Gene Hive. Aldiss is dealing here in this story with the notion of life, as I was explaining last time. What is life? The Mutant Millennia. Then came the blow that forced man to alter his attitude to himself. His metaphysical view of being had of course been constantly subject to change. Now the terrible moment arrived when he was revealed to himself to be in an entirely new light. It begins with a crewman who is exposed to little radiation on an undersea trawler, which subsequently docks in the Cape Verde subport undersea city. Dr. Saru Jayas, a medical meditation psychic healer, is summoned. She uses the standard professional procedure of submerging herself into him on a cellular level in order to correct the faulty tissue. Saru had been primed in this story by discussion of Palm-Lyra's power evolutionary theory. Palm-Lyra accepts a Plato's position, that's obviously reference to Plato there, of the dual theory, and claims that evolution is working toward greater consciousness. Plants are less conscious than animals, animals less conscious than men. Men came after the animals, which came after the plants. Plants, animals, men are only first steps in a long ladder. Palm-Lyra points out that man is by no means fully conscious. He sleeps, he forgets, he is unaware of the workings of his body. Only certain unusual individuals associated together into our present orders of medicine can to some extent participate consciously in somatic activity. The next evolutionary step would be a being, conscious in every cell, and that nature may be already preparing to usher it in onto the stage. The time apparently is ripe for the new being. And mid-story there will be a trial transcript of the disappearance of a new kind of being. A metamorphosis into a new mutation has occurred, in which each cell is malleable, self-aware. This constitutes a new replacement species for humanity. Right, the first of two diversions here, to make clear where I'm heading. Philosophy and science. Hegel opposed the concept of a Darwinian type of evolution, that is, evolution in an objective sense. Hegel died about 30 years before the publication of The Origin of Species. For Hegel, the concept is the actuality of which nature is the appearance. Actual movement transpires in the concept and is only reflected in nature. Darwin's theory and the evidence for it was not available in Hegel's time, but he was aware of the existence of this type of thinking throughout history up until his own time. His rejection of it is not grounded upon religious considerations or political, but upon the concept as expressed in the following. This is from the Philosophy of Nature. Nature is to be regarded as a system of stages, the one proceeding of necessity out of the other, and being the proximate truth of that from which it results. This is not to be thought of as a natural engendering of one out of the other, however, but as an engendering within the inner idea which constitutes the ground of nature. Metamorphosis accrues only to the concept as such, for development is nothing but the alteration of the same. In nature the concept is, however, partly a mere inner principle and partly an existence, which is simply a living individuality existent. Metamorphosis is therefore limited solely to this individuality. The inept conception, in which the progression and transition of one natural form and sphere into a higher is regarded as an outwardly actual production somewhat clarified by being relegated into the murkiness of the past, may be found in both ancient and modern philosophies of nature. It is precisely the externality which allows differences to fall apart and appear as indifferent existence, which is characteristic of nature. It is the dialectical concept which is the inner principle of the same, and guides its stages forward. Thinking consideration must reject such nebulous and basically sensuous conceptions as, for example, the so-called emergence of plants and animals out of water and of the more highly developed animal organizations out of the lower, etc. The view that natural things are useful is true in that it denies that they are absolute purpose in and for themselves. The negativity is not, however, external to them, but is the imminent moment of their idea which brings about their mutability and transition into another existence, but at the same time their transition into a higher concept. As the concept posits all particularity with existence at once, it does so in a universal manner. To think of the genera as gradually evolving themselves out of one another in time is to make use of a completely empty concept. The time difference is quite devoid of interest for thought. It is merely a matter of enumerating the genera, in order to show in a convenient way how the series of living being divides itself into general classes, from the simples of those richer in determinations and content, or the other way about. This will always be of general interest. It is a way of ordering things, as is the division of nature into the three kingdoms, and is better than mixing everything up, which tends to repel the intuitive concept in general intelligence. But one must not think one makes such a dry series dynamic, philosophical, more comprehensible, or what you will, merely by using the concept of emergence. The animal world is the truth of the vegetable world, which in its turn is the truth of the mineralogical world. The earth is the truth of the solar system. In a system, the most abstract term is the first, the truth of each sphere is the last. It is at the same time only the first term of a higher stage, however. The completion of one stage out of the other constitutes the necessity of the idea, and the variety of forms has to be grasped as necessary and determinate. A land animal has not proceeded by a natural process out of an aquatic animal and then flown into the air. Neither has the bird returned to the earth again. If we want to compare the stages of nature with one another, we are perfectly justified in observing that this animal has one ventricle, while that has two, but we cannot go on to say that parts have been added, as this had actually taken place, nor should we use the category of an earlier stage in order to explain a later one. It would be a formal howler to say that the plant constituted the carbon and the animal the nitrogen pole. So, just as one would not anticipate an explanation of the movement of an image in a mirror upon the basis of the molecules of the mirror to be forthcoming, so too the appearance of spirit in nature can never be described upon the grounds of purely natural considerations. An indication of the nature of spirit can be found by empirical observation and corroborated by the same, but nature as thoroughly implicit reason, that is, as other than explicit reason, has its moment of independence from spirit, and yet it is not completely determined in that moment. Rather, it is ultimately inseparable from spirit, as the north pole of a magnet is inseparable from its south pole, and for sure has no intrinsic movement independent of it. Indeed, nature is entirely ossified, the world as petrified intelligence, as Shelley put it, or the statue of the intellect, as Proclus put it, with respect to spirit, and this is a fact established even in the most fundamental principles of physics, whereby there is no fundamental or absolute principle of movement found in physics. It merely takes as a given fact that there is movement and then tries to describe it. So back to the philosophy of nature. The thinking view of nature must note the implicit process by which nature sublates its otherness to become spirit, and the way in which the idea is present and in each stage of nature itself estranged from the idea. Nature is merely the corpse of the understanding. Nature is the idea, but only implicitly. That was why Schelling called it petrified intelligence, which others have even said is frozen. God does not remain petrified and moribund, however. The stones cry out and lift themselves up to spirit. God is subjectivity, activity, infinite actuosity, within which the other is only momentary and remains implicit within the unity of the idea, because it is itself this totality of the idea. Nature is the idea in the form of otherness. There's a quotation from Emerson here to expand upon the point. I mean, he mentions Proclus, which I mentioned earlier as well. When Socrates in Charmides tells us that the soul is cured of its malady by certain incantations, and that these incantations are beautiful reasons from which temperance is generated in souls, when Plato calls the world an animal, and Timaeus affirms that the plants also are animals, or affirms the man to be a heavenly tree, growing with his root, which is his head, upward, and as George Chapman following him writes, so in our tree of man whose nervy root springs in his top. When Orpheus speaks of hoariness as that white flower which marks extreme old age, when Proclus calls the universe the statue of the intellect, when Chaucer in his praise of gentleness compares good blood in mean condition to fire, which though carried to the darkest house betwixt this and the Mount of Caucasus, will yet hold its natural office and burn as bright as if 20,000 men did it behold, when John saw in the Apocalypse the ruin of the world through evil, and the stars fall from heaven as the fig tree catches her untimely fruit, when Aesop reports the whole catalogue of common daily relations through the masquerade of birds and beasts, we take the cheerful hint of the immortality of our essence and its versatile habit and escapes, as when the gypsies say, it is in vain to hang them, they cannot die. This connects to the point I will be coming to later about life, the essence of life being infinity. Wittgenstein, for me bringing yet another philosopher, coined the phrase simply placed matter while distinguishing philosophy from science. Scientists reason and experiment their way to quite definite discoveries and attain their discoveries because their subject matter is matter. Matter, unlike the mind or the concept, like the good, is subject to such things as observation, controlled manipulation, modelling in space and time, public verification. Science is a method for reducing complex material things to simpler material things and general principles. Within science, it makes sense to say that the truth about your body is that it consists of cells. Such cells consist of atoms. These things are discovered by science, along with the discovery that the diversity of species derives from natural selection. Wittgenstein sees this as a problem with traditional philosophy, for whereas the scientist aims at discovery to get at the truth of matters, either by reduction, which is analysis, or generalization, which is synthesis, the philosopher applies methods to things for which no material and hence no objective properties exist. Simply placed matter. In all the formula of physics, we come across particles, however elementary they may be, merely situated in time and space, and movement itself is nowhere derived. At best, it can be merely postulated as absolute movement in terms of, for instance, Planck's constant, that is, as the result of calculations of observation, but not derivation. Named after physicist Max Planck, the fundamental physical constant links the amount of energy carried by a photon with its frequency, and so the origin of movement is not explained in physics, and it cannot be so explained. Evolution, which is basically alteration, can hence never be accounted for on a purely material basis. The problem of the prime mover of nature has been pushed to one side and glossed over by modern science. And the prime mover, of course, that comes from Aristotle's physics. Since there must always be motion without intermission, there must necessarily be something, one thing, or it may be a plurality, that first imparts motion, and this first movement must be unmoved. Now the question whether each of the things that are unmoved but impart motion is eternal is irrelevant to our present argument, but the following consideration will make it clear that there must necessarily be some such thing, which, while it has the capacity of moving something else, is itself unmoved and exempt from all change, which can affect it neither in an unqualified nor in an accidental sense. Motion, then, being eternal, the first movement, if there is but one, will be eternal also. If there are more than one, there will be a plurality of such eternal movements. We ought, however, to suppose that there is one rather than many, and a finite rather than an infinite number. When the consequences of either assumption are the same, we should always assume that things are finite rather than infinite in number, since in things constituted by nature, that which is finite and that which is better ought, if possible, to be present rather than the reverse, and here it is sufficient to assume only one movement, the first of unmoved things, which being eternal will be the principle of motion to everything else. Together with evolution, there is a theory of the original creation of the world, the Big Bang, as it is called, a physical theory describing how the universe expanded from an initial state of high density and temperature. Although nature has a history in the sense that there is a past, present and a future, as is the case for all finite existence, they ought not to be taken in an absolute sense. The absolute belongs to the realm of the infinite, and as Hegel says, the world is created, is now being created, and always has been created. This becomes apparent in the conservation of the world. Hence, there is no origin of the world in the sense that the astrophysicist endeavours to explain. Modern science has to explain too much upon entering regions that are the domain of philosophy, which is not the fault of physicists or scientists. Philosophy itself must shoulder the responsibility of clearly determining its domain and its distinction from and corroboration with science. Empirical science incorporates thought more than it concedes. Thought, for instance, is the essence of force and law. In the phenomenology, there's an extensive discussion of forces and laws, concepts that empirical science employs liberally. Furthermore, it is the essence of difference or comparison, which detail is totally undetected and unaccounted for in science. At this basic level, it is the domain of the thought of existence, and this is the non-spiritual or material level of awareness, the ordinary consciousness of understanding. Science has now gone beyond the ordinary consciousness merely in the sense of abstract mathematical formulations, which it has developed to explain physical phenomena, and it has gone beyond ordinary consciousness in the sense that it no longer deals with objects as they appear to the senses, but rather treats them as, for instance, swarms of atoms, electrons, quarks, and so on. Philosophy deals with thinking about thinking, with the thought of thought. This is not a field which is observable to the ordinary consciousness or to the senses, nor is it accessible to the understanding. It is the realm of reason or pure thought that holds immediacy in its vanishing essence only, that is to say, is pure movement itself. This is the theme of the phenomenology of spirit. To understand Hegel, we must discover how to think conceptually or speculatively at the level of reason. We must discover what the concept is and what conceptual thinking is. Authentic philosophy has a preeminent place in human culture, and just as in any discipline, and that place has to be earned by effort appropriate to such preeminence. We can take guidance from the words of a speculative writer such as Aldiss. Aldiss, who is classified as a science fiction writer, but is really a writer in the speculative tradition. And as I'm showing in these videos, speculative actually in the Hegelian sense. The distinction between philosophy and science can be made somewhat more evident through the disagreement over the interpretation of the theory of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is an exact scientific theory, but there are two schools of thought. The Copenhagen school, led by Niels Bohr, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, who held that quantum mechanics only tells us about our knowledge of the world rather than about the world itself, while the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen school claims that we can know about the world itself through science. For the latter school, headed by Einstein, quantum mechanics deals with probability functions, designated wave functions, and wave functions are not observable. They are mathematical functions of particles such as electrons, including time and space, variables, and so on. They are defined so that the squares of such functions describes the probability distribution of any particular observable, such as location, momentum, and so on. They deal with probabilities that have to do with expectations of an observer, yet in the world itself we do not speak of probabilities. The latter are only meaningful for an observer who is expecting some result. Hence the expectation of the observer is brought in as a fundamental determinate principle of quantum mechanics merely by speaking in terms of probabilities. Hence, quantum mechanics deals more with our subjective expectations than with any direct objective physical description of the world. Such is the basic argument of the Copenhagen interpretation, while Einstein held that the world acted according to fixed laws of its own and not according to any absolute probabilities, formulation, and that such laws could ultimately be discovered. Einstein proposed that there were hidden variables allowing us to get beyond the probabilistic interpretation and trace the exact movements of the world in itself, and Einstein has been demonstrated in this instance to have been incorrect. This serves as an instance whereby we can discern a clear distinction between philosophy and science. The efforts of science are directed towards a world as it is experienced directly by the senses and ordered by the understanding into laws, forces, and so on. Einstein was faithful to his calling as a scientist, while Bohr adopted a more philosophical position, since he accounted for our knowledge itself as playing a role in what we can observe about the world, and yet he was not a philosopher, since he did not formulate the problem at a higher level beyond understanding, where he could explicitly integrate the world, which is the known, our knowledge and thinking agency, which is the knower, into a coherent system, which is the task of philosophy. Hegel's philosophy of nature provides the ground for the resolution of these very problems. Cyril was in trouble, supreme trouble. Here was Garund's chance, possibly his final one, to prove his devotion to her. If he ran from her now, his chance would have passed forever, or so he told himself. For Garund could not believe his wife's indifference rested on anything but a distrust of his integrity. He turned back to her, ignoring her frightfulness. Cyril, what is wrong? He asked. What can I do? Tell me what I can do to help you. I'll do anything. The creature on the bed opened its mouth. I shall be better in a minute, it said harshly. The words did not quite coincide with its lip movements. With a heave, it stood on its feet. It was over 7 feet tall and burly. It was 7 feet tall and burly. Garund stared at it as if hypnotized, but managed with an effort of will to hold out a hand to it. It's my wife, he told himself. It's only my wife. But as it lumbered towards him, his nerve broke. The look on his face was too terrible. He turned too late to get away. It stretched out its arms and caught him almost playfully. Second diversion. Because, of course, there are issues to be addressed concerning the place of the philosophy of nature in Hegel's system. The opposition of subject to object in knowledge is characteristic of a conception of reality that can be dismantled under criticism. Hegel demonstrated that this conception is provisional, belonging only to a certain level of thought, and in a higher conception it is transcendent, and the opposition is overcome. The higher conception is the notion of self-conscious mind, or the idea as it appears in the science of logic, and it is neither merely subjective nor merely objective. It is an experience, which is its own object, an experience which is infinite and all-inclusive, and such an infinite and all-inclusive experience is the true nature of reality. But within it there are stages of development of mind, at which the real appears under categories more or less inadequate to its proper character. F. H. Bradley, who was an idealist, in Appearance in Reality, 1893, characterizes such development as falling into 3 phases. The lowest phase is immediate unreflective experience or feeling. The next phase is immediate experience, the sphere of rational thinking, in which distinctions are made within the whole and abstractions from it, and belonging to this level is the distinction between subject and object, and the conception of nature as the object of scientific knowledge set over against the knowing mind. The final phase, beyond and above rational thinking, is a third level of experience that the human mind knows only in general terms. In its fullness, it is unattainable by man and woman, who have at best only occasional premonitions of it. Nature is thereby considered as an object in opposition to a knowing subject, is held to be an abstraction, an appearance not the reality, and is a notion having a measure of truth, but one in which is not ultimately self-consistent, and which is sublated in a higher conception, which is to say that of reality as an experience that is both subjective and objective. Hegel's logic describes every phase of experience from the most rudimentary to the most explicit. In the course of the dialectic, those characteristics that science employs in its treatment of nature as an object external to mind are past and transcendent, and the final and the truest view of reality is the absolute idea in which the dialectic of the logic culminates. For Bradley, experience is reality, enough said, hence a philosophical science which professes to go beyond logic and to expound the system of nature as the idea in the form of other being appears unnecessary and spurious. The true philosophical account of nature has already been provided. Nature is an ideal construction, a partial view of the real that cannot be maintained without manifesting internal contradiction, and it belongs to an assigned level of thought and has already been dealt with and disposed of in the logic. However, philosophy ought to be clear about the fact that its content is no more than the basic import that is originally produced and produces itself in the domain of the living spirit, the content that is made into the world, the outer and inner world of consciousness. That is to say, the content of philosophy is actuality. The first consciousness of this content is designated experience. Within the broad realm of outer and inner there-ness, a prudent consideration of the world already distinguishes that which is only appearance, transient, and of little import, from that which truly in itself is worthy of the name of actuality. Since philosophy is distinguished only in form from other ways of becoming conscious of the same identical import, its accord with actuality and experience is necessary. Such accord may be regarded as an exterior yardstick for the truth of a philosophy, just as the ultimate purpose of science is to bring about the reconciliation of the reason that is conscious of itself with the reason that is, or actuality, through the cognition of this accord. Back to the encyclopedia. Actuality is that core of truth which originally produced and producing itself within the precincts of the mental life has become the world, the inward and outward world of consciousness. Actuality produced and producing itself, in this way on the surface, seems like Bradley's ideal construction, and nature is the outward part of this world. Furthermore, Hegel says in the same passage that in his logic he has treated among other things of actuality, which is true he has done, as we see here. In common life, any freak of fancy, any error, evil, and everything of the nature of evil, as well as every degenerate and transitory existence whatever, gets in a casual way the name of actuality, but even our ordinary feelings are enough to forbid a casual, fortuitous existence, getting the emphatic name of an actual, for by fortuitous we mean an existence which has no greater value than that of something possible, which may as well not be as be. As for the term actuality, these critics would have done well to consider the sense in which I employ it. In a detailed logic, I have treated among other things of actuality, and actually distinguished it not only from the fortuitous, which after all has existence, but even from the cognate categories of existence and the other modifications of being. The actuality of the rational stands opposed by the popular fancy that ideas and ideals are nothing but chimeras, and philosophy a mere system of such phantasms. It is also opposed by the very different fancy that ideas and ideals are something far too excellent for actuality, or something too impotent to procure it for themselves. The divorce between idea and reality is especially dear to the analytic understanding, which looks upon its own obstacles, looks upon its own abstractions, dreams though they are, as something true and real, and prides itself on the imperative ought, which it takes a special pleasure in prescribing, even on the field of politics, as if the world had waited on it to learn how it ought to be and was not. Actuality is the case. Why need we go beyond the logic for a separate account of nature? As he writes in the encyclopedia, the difference between the several philosophical sciences are only aspects of the specializations of the one idea or system of reason, which alone is alike exhibited in these different media. In nature, nothing else would have to be discerned except the idea, but the idea has here divested itself of its proper being. In mind again, the idea has asserted a being of its own and is on the way to become absolute. Every such form in which the idea is expressed is at the same time a passing or fleeting stage, and hence each of these subdivisions has not only to know its contents as an object, which has being for the time, but also in the same act to expound how these contents pass into their higher circle. To represent the relation between them as a division, therefore, leads to misconception, for it coordinates the several parts or science one besides another, as if they had no innate development, but were like so many species, really and radically distinct. The categories in the Naturphilosophy are not the same as those of the doctrine of essence in the science of logic. which treats of actuality, just as the categories of the philosophy of right are not the same as those of the second part of the phenomenology of spirit. As you will know if you're familiar with those works, the nature of philosophy covers the whole of reality in one aspect, that of externality. So is not the existence of Hegel's system of philosophy of nature inconsistent? Actuality produces itself within the precincts of the mental life, and that has been covered in the logic. But recall that Hegel says elsewhere that is consistent with a different interpretation of Hegel's philosophy. A conception of nature is possible, indifferent from that which Bradley considers in appearance and reality, a conception consistent with absolute idealism and justifies the treatment of nature as the other of the idea. The physico-chemical world is in space-time. According to Samuel Alexander, in his Hegel's Conception of Nature of 1886, the former is emergent from the latter, then life emerges from special configurations of physical matter, from life we get the emergent quality of consciousness, and so on. This is the view of the world as a process of evolution or emergence, in which the different forms of existing things are different stages. If something emerges from something else, it must first be present, in some way or other, in that from which it emerges. If not, it cannot emerge, but must come into being independently of what appears to be the former stage. The butterfly is said to emerge from the chrysalis only because it has all along been present in the chrysalis, albeit it has not always been present in the same form. However hard to understand the notion of becoming or development may be, this much is evident, that if a process of becoming is to be truly continuous, what emerges at the end of the process has to have been present in some form or in some degree at the beginning. The element of continuity is important, and this is something that Alexander downplays. This is not to suggest that development is just some kind of growth, that what appears in the end was originally included or contained in some diminutive form within that out of which it has grown, as an embryo is contained in and grows out of an egg. Rather, there must be some special kind of identity running through a process of development, so that the first phase is what it has in it to become. Understanding the conception confronts a difficulty, that of explaining how this is true, the difficulty of explaining what kind of identity causes through the process. But for now, all we need to concede is that there can be no process of becoming unless there is an identity coursing through it that is sufficient for us to declare that at every phase what develops is always the same, and hence is in degree or form what will eventually emerge. And there is a correlative sense in which each phase is not what it is about to become, for were it otherwise, development would be equally impossible. It follows that the process of natural evolution results in the final emergence of mind. Then mind must be present throughout its course. According to T.H. Green in Prolegomena to Ethics, which was published just after his death in 1899, and others agree with this, consciousness cannot be a product of natural evolution, but he makes the claim on the ground that what is by no means mind cannot generate mind. This is the old problem. How do we get mind from non-mind? But if we suppose that the entire process is one of mind's own development, we are not subject to such objections. Green rebuts the idea that consciousness is somehow produced out of a material which is totally other than mind, and which later becomes the object of consciousness. Fair enough. If consciousness is not in some way in the material, it cannot develop out of it. But if we can consider the material as itself a form of manifestation of mind, the difficulty is kicked into touch. There would be no foreign material. And in every phase of natural evolution, we should have actually a form of mind. All forms of existing things in space-time will be seen as ways in which mind manifests itself in the form of externality. There are problems here, needless to say, but an Hegelian conception of nature is of a world in every facet of which mind is immanent, and throughout which mind comes to consciousness in and by means of a process of self-evolution. But mind is not viewed as something merely subjective or merely psychical, and furthermore, matter is not seen as a matrix wherein life and mind come into existence at a certain point, but as itself a form of the idea, a manifestation, that is to say, of mind. The dialectical principle, active in the sphere of thought, is also the principle of natural development. Development by Hegel is restricted to the sphere of the notion, but dialectic is, as he says in the logic, the principle of all movement, all life, and all effectiveness in the actual world. Dialectic is the universal principle of movement and evolutionary process, but it is only in the activity of thought that there is the true form of development proper. The evolutionary process goes through numerous phases that constitute the range of existing things in the material world, eventually bringing mind that has been immanent all along to consciousness of itself. Material things are manifestations of mind, bringing the world to explicit consciousness in the self-awareness of mind. In the process of evolution, as a whole, in accordance with the account of nature just presented, we see the emergence of life and consciousness as stages in the development of mind. Back to Gene Hive. On top of the wall behind the guard, something moved. A thing like a python uncoiled itself and began to drop down into the courtyard. It seemed to spread over the wall like a stain as it came. But the heavy foliage of the baobab made it difficult to see what was happening. It looked to Jeffy as if a rubbery curtain set with jewels and starfish were gliding down the wall. Now it landed behind the guard. Whatever the thing was, it raised a flapper like a snake about to strike and clamped it over the unsuspecting guard's face. Then the rest of its bulk flowed over the man, damping his struggles, covering him like a cloak. Jeffy cried out furiously from his cell, but no one answered. No one cared. Most of the staff were down on the waterfront with their girls. When the thing slid off the chief guard, only a limp and flattened body lay on the bench. The hot wind trifled with the moustaches. The thing grew fingers and expertly moved the ring of keys from the dead man's belt. A segment of it then detached itself from the main bulk, which remained in the shadows as the segment scampered across the yard with the keys. It looked like an animated stool. My God, Jeffy said. It's coming here. So what is life? This is when we get really metaphysical. This is something that permeates throughout the story of Gene Hive, which really makes it an important work of speculative fiction. The new evolutionary being, a new mode of life. Living things have an interiority. In the case of the new being of Gene Hive, every cell has an interiority. Life is a dynamic reflection into itself, a journey into the interior. Self-consciousness is hunger for life. Curiosity is desire to be in an environment. Life differentiates itself into an infinity of differences. Self-consciousness grasps the unity of the differences, how difficult it is to take all of life in the profusion that comes with the world of living things. The nature of life develops further, something for which self-consciousness is moved by an immediate desire. Its essence is infinity. There is no final point to it. Essence is the supersession of all differences, in the condition of being rolled into something of greater and greater unity, of things totally disconnected. All these differentiated moments, existing members enduring existence, they really are differences because they are in a particular medium. The metaphor Hegel employs is the pure movement of axial rotation. See a previous video where I finished with it. A perfect signifier for something changing in a process while remaining still. Changing position while everything changes, orientation remains in the same place. A restless infinity, an independent relation of it is what it is in its changing, a succession of states, spatialized time. To be life, to be at one state at one time, another at another, and differences are transpiring. There are profound metaphysical problems here, the point at which life becomes something different in an intensive unity. From moment to moment, what status does each moment have in relation to infinity, to life? There are differences by being in a particular medium, part of the movement of universal fluidity. Each one only has its meaning or part of the whole. Each one is an existing member, otherwise we could not have a supersession. It would lack ontological dignity and a greater structure. Neither unity nor parts are primary, otherwise there is no life. The living thing has to be what it is at every one of its living moments in order to be live. To be life. If the cycle ends, we have a cadaver. The living thing is in a constant process of transcending itself at any given time. It is wholly living at every temporal moment. Living being is how universality appears to the living thing. Life, merely life, is insufficient for the hunger. Regard Jarrow. Gerund had gone. Taking a tip from the painted ladies, he had split into 1,000 units, all planing away on the breeze, safely, invincibly, lost among the crowd of bright insects. So I came to what is really not the end but the beginning of the story. Already a decade has passed since the events in the Cape Verde Islands. What did I do? Well, I did nothing. I neither wrote to Pamela nor called Galfhead Council. With the marvellous adaptability of my species, I managed it in a day or two to persuade myself that Gerund would never succeed, or that somehow or other he had misinterpreted what was happening to him. And so year by year, I hear the reports of the human race growing fewer, and I think, well, anyway, they're happy. And I sit up here on my balcony, and I drink my wine, and let the sea breezes flow on me. In this climate, and at this point, nothing more should be expected of me. And why should I excite myself for a cause in which I have never believed? When nature passes a law, it cannot be repealed. For her prisoners there is no escape, and we are all her prisoners. So I sit tight and take another drink. There is only one proper way to become extinct. With dignity.